When I was preparing for my episode on J.R.R. Tolkien, I went and read The Lord of the Rings for the first time. And in between each of the books, I went and watched the corresponding movie. I'd seen them in like over a decade at that point. And I became curious about Peter Jackson. Like I didn't know much about him other than the fact that he directed The Lord of the Rings. And so I knew I was going to do episodes about Peter, but I wasn't just going to jump straight to The Lord of the Rings, because when I was first rewatching the movies and I was just looking up his filmography to see what else he'd done like before that, I was surprised that I hadn't really heard of any of the movies. And there's like nothing that jumps out to you to be like, oh, I see why they gave him The Lord of the Rings. And so I wanted to go back and learn about the early part of his career before I dove into the films that really made him a household name. And so today we're going to talk about his first 5 feature films, and we're going to leave off right around the time he's about to start his work on The Lord of the Rings.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
One of the things that has stuck out to me from studying Peter Jackson is how loyal he is to New Zealand. Like the reason The Lord of the Rings ultimately ends up being shot and filmed in New Zealand isn't because they were like, New Zealand is a great place to make this movie. Who's a great director in New Zealand? We can get to do this. It's because Peter Jackson directed The Lord of the Rings and he wanted to shoot it in New Zealand. He was born just outside, or he was born in Wellington, but he was raised just outside in a small town called Prikura Bay. From what I can tell, the population has never really exceeded around like 2,000, maybe 3,000 people. So it really is a small town right on the coast with these beautiful cliffs. And that's where he grew up. He was an only child. His parents had him much later in life. I believe like late 40s into their 50s is when they had Peter. And so he grew up as an only child, and he credits a lot of his incredible imagination to that, right? Like he grew up in this small town with this beautiful landscape, these beaches that he could go and play in. So it was just him alone or him and friends running around using their imaginations to play. And if you've listened to the show, you obviously know that like this is an idea that keeps coming up. It came up a lot with James Cameron talking about growing up in Southern Ontario and just playing in the woods with his friends. And they didn't have video games. And so if they wanted to go to another planet, they had to like picture it in their minds and use their imaginations to go there. George Miller talks about something similar, how they had to use their imaginations a lot as a kid, playing with friends and coming up with storylines and acting things out. But the artist I've studied on this show who reminded me the most of Peter when he was talking about his childhood. Like there's elements of James Cameron, there's elements of George Miller with the fact they were going and playing with friends. But because Peter was an only child, you don't have access to your friends 24 hours a day. And so there's a lot of time where he's just alone at his house and he's using his imagination to come up with things. And it reminded me a bit of Robin Williams, bit of a different circumstance, but he had quite well-off parents. His father was an executive, I believe, at Ford. And so they had this huge house. He was really kind of an only child. You can like dig into the weeds on Robin Williams on like, he did have siblings and they were around more than he made it sound like they were. But for a lot of Robin's childhood, he was just in this big house alone, having to use his imagination and play with these like models and stuff. And Peter Jackson was the exact same way. He grew up, obviously he had friends that he'd play with outside, but he also spent a lot of time making models and playing by himself. And he credits a lot of his imagination to being an only child. But I just think there's something around like the importance of fostering imagination in children when they're young. It's coming up time and again with these great artists, Peter Jackson, Robin Williams, James Cameron, George Miller. And I do have these like lingering concerns about like the death of imagination. I wrote an essay on it one time because I'm worried that we're pacifying imagination by outsourcing it to somebody else. Like to James Cameron's point of like, when they were kids and they wanted to go to another planet, they would just have to go outside and use their imaginations. But now you can just go on your iPad or play on your PlayStation, you're somewhere else. So you don't have to use your imagination in the same way. But for Peter, it was an integral part of his childhood. And like I mentioned, Robin playing with these. Robin had a lot of like toy soldiers. Peter made a lot of models. Like Peter loved film growing up, but he never wanted to be a director. What Peter wanted was to be a special effects man. Like his hero growing up was Ray Harryhausen, who was like an American animator, like prop builder. Like he made like there's a camera, I think it's The Adventures of Sinbad, and he made the Cyclops in that movie. It's like stop motion villains. And that is what was, that was Peter's hero. He made these monsters and brought them to life on screen with stop motion animation. And so Peter, throughout his childhood, started trying to make these stop motion animation creatures, and he'd build models. And that was his ambition. He didn't want to be a director. He wanted to be a special effects guy. But when you're a kid growing up in Pakruah Bay and you don't have access to a lot of people and you're an only child and you got to do a lot of things yourself, as a byproduct of pursuing this passion of special effects, Peter became a director because that was just the natural thing. Like, he was making these special effects and he had a clear vision for what they were going to look like. And so therefore he's the one directing it. Obviously, when he's at home making little stop motion animation films on an 8mm camera, which was difficult because you couldn't click it fast enough. So it would take multiple frames. So it was a challenge. But even when he eventually started to make movies with his friends, the director role was something he just like naturally slotted into because he had such a clear vision. One of the first special effects he ever did was in this first movie that he ever made. He made this World War I movie with his friends because World War I is this passion for Peter. He ultimately would go on to make the movie They Shall Not Grow Old, which is a documentary about World War I. He's purchased World War I biplanes and owns them. His grandfathers fought in the First World War. So he had this passion for the First World War throughout his entire life. And so the first film he ever made was this World War I movie with his friends. And it's quite extensive. Like, Peter dug a actual trench in his parents' garden with their full support, but like a full-size trench that him and his friends could drop down into, would come up to near or over their heads. Like, it was multiple feet deep. And one of the first effects he ever did was in that movie, they have these guns that they're shooting. And in order to create the effect of muzzle flash, Peter would go through each frame in the film and he would poke holes in the film to create this muzzle flash on screen. As that was his very first effect. And it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And he kept making movies with his friends throughout his entire life. And he always had this staunch support of his parents. Like, I talked about how they let him, as an 8-year-old, dig a full-size trench in their garden. Eventually, Peter's model making and prop building for his films became so great that they decided that he needed an actual workshop. And so they dug under the house and built Peter a full workshop underneath their house so that he could continue pursuing his passion. And the movies he was making became greater and greater and more complex and more complex. He made a James Bond type movie. He recreated the Cyclops from The Adventures of Sinbad himself. And he has a film where one of his friends, I think it might even be him, throws like a log as a spear and it lodges it in the eye of the Cyclops. And he made this entire movie himself. Like, if you go back and you look at some of these films he was making as a teenager, and we're going to talk about his first movie here, you could arguably say like Peter was like a savant level of special effects person in his era. Like, this is in a time he's making these movies in the 70s into the 80s. There's no YouTube. There's like no way for him to learn this. Like, he's just figuring it out. And there's no way for me to like properly articulate like how impressive these things are. Like, you just have to Google pictures and you will see what I'm talking about. Like, Peter had an unbelievable talent for special effects. And there's also this thing too I want to hit on, is like the support of his parents that he had. Like, the fact that they just let him dig this trench, they built an entire workshop for him. Like, that is another thing, talking about like what the development of a child is like. Yes, you want to foster their imagination, and you also want to see where the sparks ignite and fan those flames. You don't want to try to light fires yourself. Like, this is what you're going to be passionate about. You let your kid show you what they're passionate about, and you support them to the fullest extent. And for Peter, he'd been shooting movies his entire life on an 8mm camera. And one day he was walking down the street and he looked in the window of, I don't remember if it was a camera store or if it was a pawn shop, but there was a 16mm Bolex camera. It was 2,500 New Zealand dollars. Peter did not have 2,500 New Zealand dollars until his parents, who knew how important this passion was to him, loaned him the money to buy the camera. I don't know if he ever ended up paying them back for it, but they just constantly supported this passion of Peter's throughout his entire life. He might have even dropped out of school early. He didn't go to university, and his parents supported him in that. They supported him. They knew it was crazy, but they knew that this is what he loved to do. And so they bought him this camera, this 16 millimeter Bolex camera, which ultimately Peter ended up shooting his first feature film on. His first feature film was called Bad Taste. And it didn't start out as a feature film. It started out as a short film that he was going to shoot with some friends on the weekends. They all worked during the week. A lot of them worked together. Peter got a job working at the paper. He was I believe, a photo engraver. And so he just got some of his friends from his childhood, some friends from work, and they were going to shoot this short film on the weekends. It was about like an alien invasion. And so they could only shoot on Sundays because that's really when everybody was available. And they shot the movie for like a year. They shot it for a long time. And Peter's like, all right, I'm going to get some editing equipment and I'm going to cut this together. So he rented some editing equipment and he cuts the movie together and he realizes, oh, this is 60 minutes. I could either find a way to cut 30 minutes from this and like whittle it down to a short film, or we could just add another 30 minutes and then we have a feature. And so Peter decided let's make a feature. And so that was the decision. They were going to add another 30 minutes, but then they ran into this issue of one of the friends that they decided to shoot the movie with eventually converted to Christianity. He got married, and the film that they were shooting, Bad Taste, was a gory, very gory movie. And so this friend was like, Peter, I can't continue to be in this film because of my new faith, and I just don't necessarily believe in what we're doing here just because I don't want to be involved in this like super gory movie. And so this guy who was an integral actor, an integral character in the film, leaves partway through production. And so they kind of shut production down for like 3 or 4 months. And Peter's like racking his head trying to come up with a way to continue the movie, to salvage what they have. And he eventually comes up with a plan on to how they can include what they've shot with this guy, but they can remove him from the rest of the movie. And then the film, ultimately what they thought was going to be just a short film, ended up taking 4 years to produce, 4 years to shoot this movie. And so this guy who got married to this woman eventually gets divorced from her, comes back, tells Peter he's happy to be in the movie again. So they write him back into the movie. And so they're able to take some of that footage and integrate it even more into the film. But they'd also had to like reshoot a bunch of stuff because they thought he wasn't going to be in the movie. And they ended up shooting it again over 4 years. One of his friends who showed up on the first day of the first day of shooting, who thought he was just helping his friend make a short film, showed up with stubble on his face. And unfortunately, he had to show up with stubble on his face every single Sunday for 4 years. So he had this ritual basically of like every Wednesday or Thursday, he would just shave his face clean and then let the stubble grow in over the course of the rest of the weekend. So it would be consistent throughout the entire shooting of the film. And one thing that's interesting about the people that Peter made this first movie with, none of them like wanted to be actors. What they wanted was to support Peter Jackson. And I think like finding people who support you that much, who will support you in your dream, even if it's not theirs, is special, and you need to hold on to those friends. And so Peter grew up in this small town, but he grew up incredibly supported in this town by his family, by his friends. He just had this good circle of people around him who encouraged him to chase this dream, which for anybody at that point in time feels like such a lofty dream. It's even greater if you're growing up in New Zealand, which had a very nascent film industry. Like there was no clear path for Peter to try and make it and go to Hollywood. Like this was just such a far-fetched thing, but every single person supported him in it. And it's not like Peter wasn't working towards, like I think they could just recognize how hard Peter was working. Peter worked 6 days a week to fund the film, and then he would show up on a Sunday and work with his friends all day long, and then go back to work on Monday and work 6 days. Like he worked every single day for years. And sometimes like things just didn't go right. Like sometimes there were Sundays they just couldn't shoot because some of his friends would have to go play in a soccer match or something, or they went drinking the night before. There's one day Peter's parents, they drove him out to the location where they were shooting, which is like up on this hill in Pakura Bay, and they left him for the day. They were going to come back and pick him up at night, and none of his friends were available that day. They hadn't let him know. And so Peter went and sat outside by himself, obviously no cell phone or anything to keep him entertained, for the entire day. And he was just like kind of waiting for his friends to show up, and they never did. But he was determined. He continued pushing through with this film. Like, that wasn't something that happened often. That happened one time. But like, his friends, for the most part, were supportive of him. But they would show up on set on Sunday, and Peter would have worked, obviously, at the newspaper Monday to Saturday to get everything done. But then he's also working after work on all of the props and everything for the film. He built all of the props for the movie himself. And when I talked about like how he's like a savant level effects person, we're going to kind of get into some spoiler territory here for Bad Taste, which if you want to watch it is available for free on YouTube. But I'm going to get into some spoiler territory just because I want to talk about how talented of an effects person Peter really is. There's a house where a lot of the movie takes place. And the movie, again, is like an alien invasion movie, and the aliens are hiding in this house. And there's a scene in the movie where they shoot a rocket launcher at the house. And the house, when I'm watching the movie, and at the time, like, I don't understand that Peter's just making this movie with his friends. Like, when I sit down to watch this movie for the first time, I assume like Peter has some level of funding. Like, I imagine it's low budget, but they've got funding of some kind. And I'm watching it and I'm like, so they shoot a rocket at this house and it like blows up the side of the house. And I was like, maybe the budget for this movie was bigger than I thought. Cause like they just blew a hole in the sides, like in this real house. Like they just blew it up. And turns out that the house that they shot a rocket into was actually like a scale model of the house that was like half the size that Peter and his friends had built themselves in a field. And I didn't realize it. And then this is where we're really getting into the spoiler territory. So if you don't want any spoilers for Bad Taste, skip ahead. The house that all of the aliens are hiding in is a spaceship. And so at the end of the movie, the spaceship takes off. And I remember watching the movie being like, how did they, like, I was like flabbergasted at that point. I was like, I really don't understand. Like, this is the house. And they just built a smaller model of the house. They put it on a crane. They had the crane lift up. They had smoke coming out of the bottom of the house to hide the crane, so you couldn't tell that it wasn't the real house. And then at the end of the movie, there's a scene where the house is spinning in outer space. And they just built an even smaller model of the house, and they put it on a turntable, and they spun the turntable, and Peter cut pictures of planets out of a magazine and put them behind the house, and you can't even tell. It's also a gory film, and Peter made all of those effects himself. It's all practical effects, obviously. And so one of the things is he felt that squibs would be too dangerous for him to try to make on his own, have little explosives. So instead what he did is he had these tubes that were in the costumes, and they would just shoot it at a certain angle so that you couldn't see the friends who were kneeling behind the person being shot, blowing on a tube, shooting maple syrup with red dye in it out of these tubes to create the blood splurting effects. That's how they shot those. There was also a lot of like guts in the movie. And I remember watching, like, how did the gut effects look really good too? Not just because they're real. Like every Friday or Saturday, Peter would go to the grocery store and he'd go to the meat section. He'd look at what are the grossest looking pieces of meat, and he would just buy them all and use them in his film. So he built all the props, but he also built like all of the gear. Like he bought this Bolex camera that he was using, but he needed cranes. He built cranes himself. He built dollies himself. He built a homemade Steadicam that he's just made based off of pictures. It wasn't perfect, but it steadied the camera more than just one person like running with a camera. There's even a shot in the movie. I'm just like, this is me just like geeking out over like how impressive this is. And it kind of gets lost in the conversation about Peter Jackson. It's like, he truly was like this, like a savant with special effects. There's a shot in the movie where Peter Jackson's character is throwing up, and they like pick him up and he starts throwing up. And I thought he was going to go like, bleh. And he doesn't. He just opens his mouth and it comes firing out like a fire hose. And I was like, and I'm looking and I'm trying to see is like, are they just pouring it out of the side? Like that, but it looks like it's coming out of his mouth. Like, how did they shoot that? And it was only after the fact when I was watching a making of documentary, it was actually a mold of Peter's head with a funnel in the back of it. But when I was watching the movie, like I didn't even clock the fact that it wasn't really Peter Jackson. I thought it was Peter Jackson. And when reflecting on the making of Bad Taste and on the practical effects that they use on this like shot of Peter throwing up or on the blood splatter effects or on the house taking off, Peter was saying that most special effects can be done really simply and cheaply. You just have to be careful with the way you film them. And that's what Peter was doing. He was filming all of these things. And like me as a viewer, when I watched this, of course, if you watch it now with this context, you might be able to see some things that I didn't. But just going in completely blind, like I was just so wildly impressed at the practical effects in this movie. And then when you realize that all of these effects are being done by Peter Jackson, just sitting in his parents' basement, technically, it's where his workshop was, making these effects himself, it becomes even more impressive. Like even the alien heads in the movie. So the aliens are in human bodies. And then at the end of the movie, they kind of like break out into their alien form. The alien heads were made in his mom's kitchen. And the reason that like they have a certain flat shape near the top of their head was he had to do that so that they would fit in his mom's oven, and they just barely fit. But he did all of this himself. Again, with no internet, with no YouTube, with nobody guiding him, he just figured it out. And that's going to be a consistent thing we're going to talk about with this episode is like Peter, like impossible is not in Peter Jackson's lexicon. Like he just finds a way. He figures it out. Even if he has literally no idea, if he has no right understanding, he just figures out a way forward, figures out a way to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. And there is impossible isn't something he understands. He will just figure it out. He will just find a way. And what's interesting about Bad Taste, I want to jump back to the fact that they shot this movie as what they thought was a short film that ended up being an hour. If you've ever written a screenplay, you know the rule is one page on the script is about a minute in the film. So how did Peter get so lost? Like, how did he not realize how much they'd shot, how long his movie was going to be? And the reason for that is because they didn't have a script for Bad Taste. The movie was just shot on vibes. They show up to set, they go, what do we want to shoot today? What would be really cool? Where are we in the story? What's the best way to pick this up? At least like that's the way it's like often like the mythology of the story is told, is like they just shot this movie with no script and they showed up on set, which is kind of true. But really like Peter was thinking through the entire film all week long. Like he's working at this job he doesn't really enjoy. He's bored out of his mind doing these pictures, engraving these pictures. And so all day he's thinking about the movie he's making and what are they going to do that weekend? Because but no one's really discussed when thinking about this, like Peter has said, like, oh, I was just so bored. I was thinking about the movie all day long. So when I showed up on the set, I knew what I wanted to do. But in order for Peter to show up on set and do the things they wanted to do, he would have to know what they were going to shoot so that he could build all of the things, all the props that he would need in order to achieve it. And then he would show up to set with these props and he would shoot based off of those props. So it's not like he was fully winging it. There was obviously a level of play. Like with Peter Jackson, like he's always playing on a movie set. Like it is never this rigid thing throughout his entire career. He's rewriting, he's adding scenes partway through, he's taking scenes out. Like a Peter Jackson script is never set in stone, even when you're on the set. He's always rewriting it. With Bad Taste, he just starts his career without a script whatsoever. He still had a plan. Like he knew where they were going, but he was very open to how they were going to get there. And this attitude even showed up on The Lord of the Rings. You even see it in the way in which he writes his scripts. So Jamie Selkirk, who's the editor of The Lord of the Rings, said very often Peter will write a scene in one line. For example, Minas Tirith, the battle begins. That's the line. One line on paper, 15 minutes on film. So he knows that we have to shoot this battle and he's not going to try to figure out the best way to write this battle scene. Like he knows they're just going to figure it out on the movie set. This is one of those things that is a thing that a great director did that isn't necessarily advice you should take and try to replicate. I think if you're an aspiring screenwriter or an aspiring director, like you obviously want to be a little bit more thorough than Peter Jackson. We're not all Peter Jackson. And so with Peter, like, I guess really the takeaway here is like, don't try to replicate Peter Jackson. Like that's not the lesson, but the lesson here is that there is no one way to do things. If you have a way that works for you to make a movie, like I've never directed a film, but if I was to show up on set with a script that just said, ministereth, the battle begins, I would be lost. Peter Jackson, that is his like zone of genius. Like that is the way, that is how you get the most out of Peter Jackson. And he recognizes that. And so for you, I guess the real lesson is like understand the way in which you work and the way in which to get the best out of yourself. And that is going to be the best way for your art. Oftentimes, at least with me, it's like you can create this like rigid structure of how you think you have to do things or how other people do things, and that's how you should do them. And it actually becomes restrictive on you achieving your greatest the highest version of your creative self. And so Peter was able to recognize that, and he was able to play to his strengths in the way in which he made films. Obviously, Bad Taste is what was originally truly started as just like a homemade movie that grew and grew into something much greater. But for him in the beginning, that like set the foundation of how he was going to approach his films throughout the rest of his career. And on that note of like this movie was just originally a homemade movie that just grew into something greater. Peter self-funded this movie. Like he eventually, when he realized that, oh, this is actually going to become a feature, he started writing to the New Zealand Film Commission trying to get funding. The New Zealand Film Commission at the time was making these like slice of life movies. And so the idea of using their limited budget to fund a splatter film was not necessarily something that they were super excited about. And if you actually read this biography, Peter Jackson, A Filmmaker's Journey by Brian Sibley, he has letters in the book that Peter wrote to the New Zealand Film Commission trying to persuade them to fund his film. And he's doing it in this way that's like not, you could say adversarial potentially, but he just staunchly believes in the movie he's making. And he is confident it is going to be a great movie. And he's not trying to pander to the film commission to get their money. He's trying to get them to invest in the movie that he is trying to make. And for the entire duration of the film, the production, they keep saying no. He eventually does get $250,000 near the end of production. $30,000 of it went to the actual production, but $220,000 went to post-production. And some of that was like trying to get good music for the movie. But the point I'm trying to make here is Peter spent a lot of this just self-funding it. Like that's why he was working 6 days a week. He has this great new camera that he wants to shoot this movie on. What he didn't realize when he bought the camera was that the film stock was much more expensive for 16 millimeter than it was for 8 millimeter. So now he was spending $100 a week on the film stock that they were going to shoot with that weekend. And so he's spending all of this money. I think he ended up spending $20,000 to $30,000 of his own money on the movie. And it actually ended up being something that carried him through. Like he was able to use sunk cost fallacy to his advantage, because when he's going through this movie over the course of 4 years, mind you, like 4 years is a long time. If you really think about it, only shooting 1 day a week, there was periods of time where he got really down and he was just like, what am I doing? I should just throw in the towel. I should just give up making this movie. But then he'd think about it and be like, but I've spent so much money trying to make this movie. I might as well finish it just so I at least have something to show for all of the money that I spent. And I think like we can talk about the fact that like, yeah, he did spend a lot of money. And yes, he did, because he spent a lot of money, it carried him through. But there's also this sacrifice that Peter's making to make this movie. He's not going out on the weekends. He's not going on any trips. He's living in his parents' house still into his mid-20s, which at the time was less common than it is today. Still living with his parents, and all of it in pursuit of this dream that he has. But what's interesting, like the contrast to that is the fact that like he wasn't making Bad Taste to try to like get somewhere. Like it's not like he was like, I have to make this and that's going to allow me to get in front of the New Zealand Film Commission. That's going to lead to this, which is going to get me this, or this is going to get me this opportunity. Like Peter just started making the movie because he loved making movies and he wanted to make a movie. End of story. Like that was the reason he made Bad Taste, because he wanted to make movies. Like you can make things for the thing itself. And I think so often people make things today, not for the thing, but for what the thing could be or what it could become, right? Like they don't make it for the thing. They make it because they want it to be something. And you can just make things for the love of the thing. And maybe it does become something. Like Bad Taste, yes, did eventually get picked up, it got distribution. They took the movie, it got funding from the New Zealand Film Commission. They took it to Cannes, received quite well. It sold to many countries. But that wasn't like the intention with making the movie at the beginning. Like they literally just set out to make a movie, not to make it a movie that they took to Cannes and got distributed to all these countries. Like they just wanted to make the thing. And I think so often we get so focused on the outcomes. I'm doing the thing to get to this, that we forget about the joy of making the actual thing that's in front of us. And that's the reason why we started. And for Peter Jackson, that was why he made Bad Taste. And as you're going to see as we go through this, like that's the reason he just makes movies. Like that is his number one priority, to make a great movie. And Peter, of course, is like, he's untrained. He's just making this himself. And what was interesting is Michelle Scullion, who's the composer of the film, was talking about how when they were working on the soundtrack, when they were working on the music for the film, she said, Peter sat on my shoulder the whole time. He may have lacked musical vocabulary, but he had all these words necessary to explain the shape and the emotion of what he wanted. I was surprised that someone so new to the film business could do that, but he was not only smart, he was an incredibly quick learner. And this is really one thing that I highlighted this thing in particular because the lesson that I wanted to talk about was the fact that like, you don't need to know technically how to do everything. Obviously, if like you're doing things solo, like yes, you need a level of technical proficiency to do these things. But when you start to work with collaborators, you don't need to necessarily know technically how to do all of the things that they're doing. What you need to know is how you want the audience to feel. And can you describe the feeling you want to invoke in the audience to other artists? If you can get them to understand the emotion you want them to feel, they can take their skill set and they can go and make the thing that you are incapable of making. You're guiding the feeling, you're not necessarily guiding the technicality. Which calls me back to something we talked about in the last episode I did on Ghost of Tsushima, the video game, was that everyone on that video game talked about they were focused on like the player fantasy. And the player fantasy isn't what the player is asking for. It's the player fantasy is how you want the player to feel when they play your game. And so everything they are doing is in service of making the player feel a certain way. And that was the ambition with the video game. And it's the same thing with movies. It's the same thing with books. It's the same thing with paintings. It's like, what do you want the person who's looking at this thing, who's experiencing this thing to feel? You need to be able to articulate that. And that is your North Star, the feeling that you want the audience to have. And again, the audience, when watching Bad Taste, at least it can, responded quite well to it. It ultimately launched Peter Jackson's career. Again, what was, in theory, really a home movie, launched his career. It also created the genre splatstick, which is essentially like, it's the first splatstick film, and Peter's other films would go on to kind of like concretize this genre, but essentially it's like slapstick comedy, but with a lot of blood, guts, and gore is the way to think about it. Like, this is a very gory movie, but there's a lot of humor in it, and a lot of Peter's other films have that humor in it. And so that's where this splat for the gut, the blood, the guts, the gore, but like slapstick. When he was reflecting on the making of Bad Taste years later, he said, Bad Taste was really like a great film school. In New Zealand, we don't have film schools, though I wouldn't have wanted to go to one even if we did, because I just get impatient. I don't want to sit there being told what to do. I'd rather just go out and do it and make my own mistakes. Just go out and do it. Don't wait around. No one is coming to save you. One of the clips at the beginning of this show is a James Cameron interview from, I think, 1992, where he's like, you don't get a lucky break. Like, you make your breaks. No one's going to give one to you. You just have to go out and do it. Don't wait around for anybody to come and give it to you. Go and get it yourself. And Bad Taste, because it was well received, and it just kind of has this like cult following today, Peter said he started to feel pressure at the time to make a sequel to Bad Taste. And he said that made me all the more determined not to. I wasn't going to allow myself to be pigeonholed so early in my career. I was keen to learn about script writing, work with experienced people and professional actors. I made a promise to myself at the time that I would only do it when I wanted to, when I was excited by the idea. That last line, I made a promise to myself at the time that I would only do it when I wanted to, when I was excited by the idea, is important to remember and is probably foreshadowing of some stuff we're going to talk about later on in this episode. But as late as 2006 was when this book was published, Peter was still wanting to make a sequel to Bad Taste. In fact, in the 90s, after he started to have more success and earn a name for himself, even more so in his career, he was pitching a second and third film in the Bad Taste franchise. And the description of the movie is quite insane at the time, at least. But what he was pitching when he was coming up with these two films is like he wanted to shoot them at the same time. He wanted to shoot 2 and 3 together. And while Bad Taste 2 and 3 never ended up being made, the idea of shooting these two films back to back is something he carried into the production of The Lord of the Rings. In fact, he even said that, like, Lord of the Rings, the approach that he took when making the trilogy was the approach that he took making Bad Taste, just on a huge scale. He said both of these films, like Bad Taste being 1, Lord of the Rings 1, 2, and 3, both took 4 years to shoot and both employed the same filmmaking techniques. The way we made Bad Taste was not a bad way to make a film, and that is why I adopted a similar approach to The Lord of the Rings. Neither was made using the principle, lock a script down, rush off and shoot it without any changes, cut it, and release it. I don't think a rule that says you get one crack at a script and that it never changes is a particularly smart way of making films. I prefer an approach that enables you to pause every now and again and say, yes, this is working, okay, but I could really do with a scene that does this. I like to put in a sequence that does that, or I need to explain this a bit more. And then you go and shoot those things as we did with the pickups we filmed for The Lord of the Rings. Handcrafting a film has always appealed to me. Refining, finessing, streamlining as we go along. It's a process that started with Bad Taste. And what also started with Bad Taste was Peter Jackson's career. After Bad Taste, they made this short film called Meet the Feebles, which they did for, I believe it was a television show in New Zealand. But this Japanese producer got really excited about it and wanted to turn it into a feature film. But they shut that idea down because they were working on this movie called Brain Dead, which they'd started writing. And I say they being Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, who ultimately he ended up marrying, and some of their other friends were working on this movie called Brain Dead, which was a zombie movie that he really wanted to make. They got funding for the movie. They started pre-production. They were building things for the film. And then 6 weeks before the movie was about to go into production, the funding got pulled. The film collapsed. They had to go into the offices and basically tell all of these people that they just lost their jobs. It was one of the hardest days in Peter Jackson's career. He has a picture he took on that day of somebody, I can't remember who was, telling everybody that the bad news. And so he got home, obviously quite beat up over this. And his mission was like, I need to figure out what the next thing is so that we can get going again on another film so I can hire back all those people we just had to let go. And so the thing that they had that was most likely, the best potential they had to do that was to turn the short film that they had into a feature film. Again. Just like Bad Taste, started out as a short, was supposed to just be a short, ended up becoming a feature. They go back to the New Zealand Film Commission. They say, hey, like, we have this other movie we're going to make that we based off this short film we did. We could do it for the quarter of the price that we were going to do Brain Dead for. There's a very loose pitch to the New Zealand Film Commission, but they greenlit it anyways. And everyone is a very meritocracy. Everyone on the film set was making the same money, from the runner all the way to Peter Jackson. Everyone made $600 a week, and that was it. But they got the film greenlit. They got to hire everyone back to go and make this film. This reminds me of this lesson I learned studying George Miller. And George Miller is the director of Mad Max, Happy Feet. And his thing is like, he always has to have a backup. Because in the film industry, there's no such thing as a guarantee. You don't know if a movie is going to come out until there are people sitting in a theater watching it. Like, even when you look at Batgirl as a recent example, like, that movie is done and edited, it's in the can, and it still hasn't come out. In that case, for tax reasons. you never know when a movie is going, the rug can get pulled out from you at any time. And for you, you don't want to be left in a situation like that with nothing to do. You always need to have a backup. So, okay, if this doesn't go, then I have this. And if that doesn't go, I have this. Like it's always good to have kind of multiple pans going at the same time. You're not putting all of your eggs in one basket. And while Peter didn't necessarily have that plan at this stage in his career, he got lucky by just having Meet the Feebles there. Like he did have a backup that he didn't realize that he had. It's not like brain dead the funding gets pulled and he's like, okay, we're going to go make Feebles now. It was like brain dead, funding gets pulled. He's like, okay, well, what do we do now? He's like, I guess we could go make this short film and turn it into a feature. But it is something that like he would continue to do throughout his entire career. It's like he tried to overlap the films that he was working on. He said, this is later, but what I'm trying to do is overlap things. I'm trying to prepare my next film while I'm still cutting this one. I don't want to be in a situation where it takes me so long to get a film off the ground that I'm hanging around doing nothing. And this is a little bit different from like having a backup. What he is saying is like, he understands that to get a film going is going to take a lot of time. So he's going to try to get some early momentum to get the film ready. So that as soon as he finishes one film, he can step into another. Another advantage of doing that, of having a backup or of working in this way that Peter's talking about, where he's like overlapping projects, that there's always like this consistent momentum building, is it gives you an opportunity to pitch something real when people start watching your current movie. When it comes out and people are excited about it, you already have something you can tell them about that they can get excited about. Like you have a real answer. You're not like coming up with a scrambled answer off the top of your head when someone asks like, what are you working on now? You have something real. Peter said the best time to float a new project is when people are being enthusiastic and saying nice things about your previous one. If you're selling people a film at Cannes or MyFed, that's the perfect opportunity to tell them your latest idea and show them the next script, to strike while the iron is hot. Do not put all of your eggs in one basket. And this is just a valuable lesson for anybody at any stage in their career. Like if you're somebody like Peter Jackson, you're starting to get some momentum, you have some films on the go, you have had some films that have come out, you're working on new projects, like it's good to have a few things that you can use. But also if you're somebody who's like just trying to get into the industry, if you're just starting to write screenplays, if you're doing a bunch of spec scripts, do not devote all of your time to just like getting one script done and working on it forever and ever and ever, trying to make it perfect. You're going to work on it for a good period of time. Like obviously put the time and put the effort in to make it really good, to try to get it to be perfect, but it will never actually become perfect. So do not spend all of your time there. Like have multiple scripts going. If somebody likes your writing style, but they don't like the script, like, oh, it's just not a story for me. You'd be like, great, well, I also have this one, or I also have this one. Like there's value to having multiple things that you can show people. It's just increasing your surface area for luck. And if you put all of your eggs in one basket, when that basket gets dumped, you're left with nothing. That is just something I wanted to call out here, is the fact like the reason that Peter was able to keep the momentum going in his career when his movie got pulled is because there was a backup plan for him. And so when they decide to then go when they go with this backup plan, when they decide to turn Meet the Feebles into a feature film, they weren't doing the same thing they did with Bad Taste, where they're like, we're just going to extend the short film. Like they were starting completely from scratch. And because they were trying to do things quickly, because they wanted to get all the people back who they just lay off, they had 3 weeks to write the script, and then 3 weeks from the completion of the script to being in production. So they had 6 weeks to go from pretty much nothing to shooting a film. And so the writing of the movie was a little bit interesting. Like they had a costume builder, a puppet maker, and he would draw characters that he would make, and they'd look at the picture of the character. They'd be like, okay, who is this character? What do we know about him? He looks like this. Okay, so this is what the characters, they would come up with the backstory of the character and how the character fits into the story. And the story of Meet the Feebles is, I mean, there's not really a story. Essentially what you're watching is like a mature Muppet film, R-rated, X-rated in some instances, of this is like this stage troupe getting ready for a big show that they have coming up. And you have somebody who's just showing up, like this very naive, sweet character who's starting his first day with the Feebles. That's the story. And so they're coming up with all of these like very like stereotypical, archetypal characters based off of what they look like in their drawings. And it's an interesting film. And so they're writing all of the characters. It was just an interesting movie in its like completion. It's an interesting movie in how it got made, because so they're coming up with the story based off of drawings of the characters, which is fun, right? Like I talked about with the J.R.R. Tolkien episode, like Tolkien basically flushed out all of the Lord of the Rings, starting with a language. He had a language that he had created. And he's like, okay, well, now I need to fill in all of the details of the world, starting from the language, working from there. And from there, it's like, okay, well, it's spoken by elves. Okay, well, who are these elves? Where do these elves live? What is the history of these elves? Who are the important people with the elves? Like, just kept asking questions and built out the entire mythology of Middle Earth, starting with Elvish. This is obviously not as grand an example, but here they're just starting with pictures and they're fleshing out an entire story based off of that. And so it's fun sometimes to like come up with stories based on prompts like this. And even one time doesn't have to be like the thing, but it's just a good way for you to practice coming up with ideas as a writer, as a storyteller. My friend Cheyenne puts on a event series here in Toronto where it's called a Silly Goofy Writing Series. I went to the first one he did, and he gives you prompts and you just have to write short stories or some form of creative writing based on the prompts that he gives you. And so the prompt that I ended up writing a story about, which is just like forces you to come up with a story that you never would have come up with. I had to write a story based on a mouse locked in a cheesecake factory. And so I came up with this whole story about this mouse that basically was due to rapid development in the city or in like the area that it lived. It lost its home because they were turning it into a suburb. And so it was on the run and homeless and hungry, and it was being chased by a cat, and it ended up in the mall. And in the mall, it like scurried around the mall freaking out until it eventually made its way into the Cheesecake Factory, and it was able to hide in the Cheesecake Factory until everybody left and didn't realize where it was. It just thought it found a hiding place. And then it finally creeps out of its hidey hole to realize there's nobody there. But when he's creeping out, he realizes he's in the Cheesecake Factory. And when he's in the Cheesecake Factory, he starts eating all of these cheesecake. But because he hadn't eaten in so long and he was so hungry, he ate himself to death. And this like story ends with this mouse dying in the Cheesecake Factory because it ate too much cheesecake. And like that's like a story I never would have come up on my own. But like my friend gave me this like clear prompt that I was able to use as like the sandbox that I was going to play within. And so sometimes again, I would never do anything with this story, but like it is something that again, it was a fun way for me to like practice my creativity in a way I wouldn't normally. And so Peter and Fran and the team wrote Meet the Feebles based off of the prompts essentially, which was we're writing a story about this. Here is the character. How does this character fit in? And that was how they wrote it. They also, interestingly enough, because they were shooting, it's all puppets, they recorded all of the dialogue before they shot the movie. And so Peter, before they went to shoot it, they had all the dialogue recorded, which like they did the 3 weeks of 3 weeks of writing, and they have 3 weeks of like pre-production, I guess. And that's when they recorded all of the dialogue. Peter was unable to basically listen. They had the dialogue cut together. He could just lay on a couch with his eyes closed, and like picture the entire film. So he did a lot of like visualization before going to shoot Meet the Feebles, which is probably a good thing. Because like he probably needed a good baseline to fall back to, because if you thought Bad Taste shooting this movie over 4 years only on Sundays was a grind, Meet the Feebles was a nightmare. And whereas Bad Taste was a grind stretched out over an extended period of time, Meet the Feebles was a nightmare crammed into like, I think it was 11 weeks. They shot the movie. They built a set in an abandoned railway shed that they were going to use for Bad Taste, for Brain Dead, that they didn't end up using because the movie fell through. So they shot in this abandoned railway shed. This abandoned railway shed was freezing cold. Like people wore toques and multiple layers and gloves when they were shooting it. There was pigeons inside, and those pigeons would die. And so there was dead birds in there. There was bird poop all over the place. There was a rat infestation. Because there was a rat infestation, there was often wild cats. Those wild cats had fleas, and so there was fleas all over it. Fleas were getting inside the puppet costumes. And so you'd sometimes see a performer like acting out the scene, and then they would just start to twitch because they were being bitten by fleas. And like there was even a scene, this is not quite as crazy, this is more so just like we just had to figure it out. They needed smoke for a scene, but they didn't have smoke machines. So they just started burning old tires. The New Zealand Film Commission, I mentioned earlier how when they pitched this to the film commission, they just kind of gave like a very loose pitch for like, look, the movie fell through, but we could do this other one with like a quarter of the budget. And they're like, hey, cool, just go make it. When they realized what Meet the Feebles was, which is this like very mature R-rated, X-rated Muppet movie with like, just like, it was just insane. When they realized what was being made, they kind of panicked. And they tried to get them to cut a bunch of stuff from the movie. They threatened to pull funding off of Meet the Feebles. Like basically because they were funding it, they had the legal right to eject Peter from the film and insert their own director. And so they kind of had to like try to appease the film commission as best they could. And they got to the point where they were at the end of their shooting schedule. They were 11 weeks in. They didn't want to ask the film commission for an extension because they knew if they did that, Peter was going to get kicked off the film. So they shot the final week of Meet the Feebles in secret. They shot it only at night, and they had to do it without the film commission knowing. They like sneak into the set. They had to shoot it without anybody knowing. Peter self-funded it. He paid everybody, the full cast and crew, for that because he couldn't, because they were out of money from the film commission. So he just paid for it out of pocket. And yeah, it was a nightmare. Like, it was an incredibly difficult shoot. And Peter was talking about the movie making process. And he said there's this incredibly magical part to it at the beginning where you're basically writing it or creating it in your head with other people, and you're coming up with ideas and you're seeing it all in your mind as the perfect movie. Then it suddenly turns into a factory, which is a nasty bit in the middle, which you have to actually get nuts and bolts and hammers and nails and a lot of people and make it, put the images onto the film, and it's never as good as you see in your mind. It's always depressing, and it's a lot of hard work, and it goes on for months and months. Then it slowly becomes magical again. It almost like claws its way back from being this thing that's come off of a production line into something that's magical as you're editing the pictures together, and you're adding sound effects, and you're adding music, and step by step, finally in the end, you're back to a magical project. And I think this is just really important to understand because your goal as an artist is to have this vision and to fight for your vision as much as you can to try and take this thing that's in your head and get it as close to that in reality. But the ideas in your head are never what is actually real. Like reality, once your ideas hit reality, they're going to change. And so what Peter is describing here is the process as an artist that you're going to go through. When you try to take an idea out of your head and put it into the world, there's going to be this period of time where you basically have to accept the fact that it's not going to look like what you thought it was going to look like. That's like the perfect is when you're coming up with the idea and then you start to put it into practice and you realize over time, like, oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. This is changing. This is what I had in my head. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then what he's describing when you come at the other side is when you accept the fact that it's not what you thought it was going to be, but you're able to take what life was giving you and come up with something else, something just as magical, but different. And I think that that's just an important acknowledgement for you as an artist, is like, it's not going to be what you thought it was going to be, but the process of shaping it, of taking your idea and what the world gives you and molding them into something beautiful is a magical experience that you can do as an artist. And you just have to there is that middle part that you'll often go through that you just have to keep pushing. And this movie that they made, Meet the Feebles, I talked about how the New Zealand Film Commission realized what they were making and they were like, oh no, we should never have funded this movie. You can go watch Meet the Feebles on YouTube right now. It's free. The first 4 movies I'm going to talk about today are all available on YouTube completely for free. So you can go and watch this. And I'm going to warn you, it's a weird movie. It got mixed reviews when it came out. As a cult following today. It's definitely for a specific type of fan or a specific type of movie watcher. But it has this cult following. But at the time, the New Zealand film industry was making these movies these slice of life movies that I was talking about. And Peter, through his entire career, loved to reference this Alfred Hitchcock quote, where he says something to the effect of people like to make movies that are a slice of life. My movies are like a slice of cake, which is, it's not this real life thing. It is this it is a movie. It is taking you somewhere else. It's taking you up into the big screen. And it's just this fantasy that I am creating. And Peter wanted to prove essentially to the New Zealand Film Commission, you could make slices of cake in New Zealand. You didn't just have to make slices of cake in Hollywood. You could do it here, where they're from, in New Zealand, without the budgets that Hollywood did. And so for him, that's always his goal. It's I want to just make this thing that is fun. He's I want to just make movies that are fun for me, that I want to watch. He was asked one time about like, why did you make Meet the Feebles in this way? Like, why did you make this like super raunchy, dirty, inappropriate, like puppet movie? And he was like, well, I just asked myself, like, if I was going to watch a puppet film, what would I want to watch? And that is ultimately like what Meet the Feebles is. It's just like Peter Jackson made this thing that he wants to make. And he said, I'm quite a selfish filmmaker. The movies that I'm making are exactly the type of films that I would want to go and watch myself. I just think that movie making is an extension of a sort of childhood fantasy, because when I was a kid, I was always playing with wooden bricks and creating castles and Matchbox toys and creating little stories in my head. I just don't think I've ever grown out of that phase. And if you've listened to this show at any point in time, I have this infatuation with the idea of the inner child, and like through our lives, the inner child, like this creative, imaginative part of ourselves, is like suppressed more and more and more and more and more. And of the life's journey, like life is just realizing that what you thought was cool when you were 12 is like still cool today. But this idea of like the inner child, like just allowing yourself to play and be free, is something we just like lose as we grow up. And like, I'm fascinated with the idea of like, how do we bring that back? Because that is like one of the secrets, that's the magic to making great things, is like, you don't care what other people think. Like, you are truly playing and making this thing that you want to make. And the caveat here, of course, is like, that doesn't mean you don't consider the fact that you want other people to watch it. Of course you do, but this thing should start with you. And what do you want to see in the world? And for Peter, when it came to Meet the Feebles, he's like, if I was to watch a puppet movie, what would I want to watch? And for him, that was Meet the Feebles. And again, some people like it. Definitely, I think it's an interesting film. It's not a movie I'd probably ever watch again. It's like not necessarily for me, and that's okay. Again, there are people who this movie is for. And when shortly after it came out, like, it didn't necessarily get widespread distribution. And when Peter's being interviewed for Brain Dead, his next movie, he was being interviewed, and this guy asked him, like, are you frustrated with all the bootlegs of Meet the Feebles? And Peter said he wasn't necessarily frustrated. Like, obviously people want to see it. They're going to find a way to see it. And the reason that they have to bootleg it is just because it's not available. And so for him, he said that if his next movie, Brain Dead, if it does well, then Meet the Feebles will become widely available because distributors will want to publish his last movie. I remember hearing that, and the note that I wrote down in my notes when I was watching this interview was like, we judge success so quickly. Like, so often, and I understand, like, when you're judging things financially, like when you put out a movie, like how much does it make? Did it make it back against its budget? But like, we judge the success of things so quickly. And what Peter is kind of saying here is like it's 2 years out of Meet the Feebles. It's been out for 2 years. And what Peter's saying is like, the jury's still out about whether or not people are going to love this movie. Like, just movies, like, the test of time takes time. And we're so quick to judge whether something works or doesn't work, or was popular or isn't popular, or was successful or isn't popular, or wasn't successful or isn't successful. Like, it just takes time. And Peter knew that, like, if his next movie does well, his back catalog is going to rise with it. You see this all the time. When a sequel comes out, the movie, the previous one does well on Netflix. When an artist puts out a new album, people go back and stream their latest album. Like, even for me, I listen to this band. There's this band I really like. I listened to the album a while ago. They just put out a new album. My fiance bought it for me for Christmas as a CD. I've been listening to it a lot. I really liked it. I went and saw their show. They performed a couple songs of the show that I never heard before. And I was like, yo, those songs were really good. And so I went back and listened to the old songs. Like, the reason I went back and am like binging this band, or like just like obsessively listening to this album that this band put out, the band is Rainbow Kitten Surprise, is because they just put out a new album. Like, you don't necessarily like judge success in the moment, and don't be discouraged if you put something out and not a lot of people watch it, because the next thing you put out that's going to do well is going to bring a bunch of eyeballs to it. Don't judge success too quickly. But if we zoom into the moment of like when Peter made Meet the Feebles, he did lose money making Meet the Feebles. He also self-funded the short film, so he did money doing that. He wanted to get Brain Dead greenlit, and he had no money coming in. But the movie was like kind of slowly working in the background. But this is more so just a fun fact. But in order to just get some money in the door, Peter was paid $20,000 to write a script for the sixth Nightmare on Elm Street. Never got made because they hired a couple of different writers to submit their scripts and Peters never got picked. But this helped him get by, and it helped him like make enough money to finally get to the point where Brain Dead was going to be made. And I really just share that story because like often we focus on like the highlights and the big wins, but like this is early in Peter Jackson's career and he's doing the thing. He's chasing his dream. He's making movies. He's getting paid, quote unquote, to do so, but he's still losing money where he just has to take $20K to write a random script that's never going to get made just to get by. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is like when you're chasing your dreams, yes, there's like this romantic notion to it. It can be ideal, but like sometimes when you're chasing your dreams, you have to get a little practical of like, you have to eat, you have to have somewhere to sleep, you have to have a roof over your head. And so sometimes you just have to do things to get by in pursuit of those dreams. And for Peter, that was obviously still for some people, that is your dream, but like writing a script for a sixth Nightmare on Elm Street movie, which had it been made, I think he would have been very excited. I'm not saying Peter didn't enjoy writing this, but like sometimes you just have to be practical and do what you have to do to get by. And for Peter, so Nightmare on Elm Street 6 kind of comes in this point of like waiting for after Meet the Feebles, which he lost money on, to finally getting to make Brain Dead. And I say finally because not only did like the movie lose funding before they made Meet the Feebles, but like they've been working on Bad Taste for years at this point, or sorry, Brain Dead for years at this point. They'd done 9 drafts of the movie over 6 years. They wrote the first draft for Brain Dead during year 3 of Bad Taste. And the movie went through tons of different iterations. At one point, it was going to be a Spanish-New Zealand co-production, so they wrote in this Spanish character that ended up staying through future iterations. Between I think it was the 8th and 9th draft of the script, Peter finally decided like, oh, actually there should probably be a period piece because the main character kind of gets pushed around by his mom. And if it's a contemporary film, I think people won't take him seriously because he's being pushed around by his mom. And that's probably going to be more accepted if it takes place in something like the 50s. So we shot the movie in the 50s. And so they changed the entire time period of the movie. And like, there's a couple lessons in here of the fact, like 9 drafts over 6 years, like, the thing you start out with is almost very rarely what it ends up being in the end, like kind of what we just talked about, but also this idea of the ones you want the most tend to take the longest. Like this was the movie that Peter wanted to make. It took 6 years to make it. Versus Meet the Feebles, surprise opportunities tend to happen quicker. Like Meet the Feebles was not something he would ever have planned on making into a feature film, but he ended up making it almost immediately when the opportunity presented itself. And so there's just something about that idea, like the ones you want the most are the ones that tend to take the longest, and the surprise opportunities are the ones that happen the quickest, probably because they're surprises and you don't see them coming, so there is no anticipation. But nonetheless, Peter was finally making Brain Dead after 6 years. And he learned from the lesson of the Nightmare Meet the Feebles production. Like the production of Brain Dead was really quite smooth. I think they finished filming on time. And him and Richard Taylor, who I believe the name of his company at the time was RT Effects, it is known today as Weta Workshop, started planning the film 6 months in advance. They started building props 4 months in advance. And it never goes, like the lesson here, I think one, in defense of Peter and like learning from the lessons of Meet the Feebles, like he just didn't have the luxury of having time to plan for Meet the Feebles, but he still took that lesson in and was very meticulous in his planning for Brain Dead. And the lesson that I wrote down here was like, it never goes to plan, but it goes so much worse without one. And that is the value of a plan. Like it kind of sets the baseline for how low you are going to fall. And really because of the fact that like this movie went so well, like I don't have that many lessons from it. There also isn't like that much media available on the making of Brain Dead. But this movie was one of the goriest films, arguably the goriest film ever made. Like this is kind of spoilers, but I'm gonna try to do it without much. But like one of the last scenes in the movie is just unbelievably gory, and it goes on for longer than I think you would expect. and longer than I think a lot of critics would have liked it to. Like that was one of the biggest critiques that Peter got when seeing reviews for Brain Dead was like the last scene's a little bit self-indulgent and it goes on for too long. And Peter said, when talking about the reviewers or the critics said, they say, oh, well, we really quite enjoyed it, but it should have been shorter at the end. And I just say, I made the film for the fans. They're not going to mind. And that reminds me of this thing James Cameron said when he was talking about Avatar 2, where people were saying making similar critiques about the battle at the end of Avatar 2. It was like, well, the battle kind of goes on for longer than it needs to. It's like quite indulgent. And James Cameron was like, well, yeah, like I'm indulging myself here. Like if I'm just going to show what looks cool and what I think is cool, and I think it's cool, then I'm going to want to show you more of it. Like, yeah, it's indulgent because it's supposed to be. And on Peter's point of like, I made this film for the fans, like there's an important question of like, who are you making the film for? Are you making it for who and why are you making this film? Are you making it for the fans? Are you making it for the critics? Are you trying to make something that's like Oscar bait and we want to win awards with this? Are you just trying to make the most money? Like what is your goal with what you're making? I think it's important to clarify that with yourself. So like you set your expectations in the right place. I think obviously for me, like the ultimate ambition is like to make something that has like depth and width of impact. Like how can you deeply impact the most people as possible? And I think with something like a Brain Dead, it's like a fun movie. You can turn your brain off and just enjoy the gore and the blood and the guts and all of that. But it's probably not going to like deeply impact you as a creative person. At least it didn't impact me on that level. And that's okay. Like maybe that's not why you're making everything. And for Peter, he was just making this movie for the fans. So yeah, the movie goes on a little bit long at the end of like, he thinks that the fans would like it and he didn't really care if the critics liked it or not. But because he was aware of the type of movie that he was trying to make, he was very cognizant and conscious of like the way in which it was going to be distributed. Like he didn't want a wide release for Brain Dead. He said, films like this, you've got to be careful with because I wouldn't ever encourage them to do a particularly wide release, 500 prints or something, and throw it out there because that type of film needs to succeed in the first week. And if it doesn't, they take 450 prints off and leave a few. A film like Brain Dead doesn't work like that. You've got to just build it slowly and let word of mouth go ahead of the movie. I mean, I hope the release ultimately spreads throughout North America so people that want to see it can see it, but I would never actually encourage like a big wide mass release for a film like that. It would never work. And I like, again, there's just a level of self-awareness here that I like. Like obviously he knows who he's making the movie for. He understands what type of movie it is. And I think being realistic can help you approach the movie in the right way. Like what is the best way to approach distributing this thing that I've made? And maybe a wide release isn't the right way to do that. Right? Like of course there's like, you can like accelerate things like the note that I wrote down in my notes here is like, be realistic with what you made. Like a fire can take time to flame. It can take time to fan a flame. That's what I meant to say. But you can also cause a bigger fire right away, but that just takes more gasoline. And gasoline is money. Like you could pour money onto Brain Dead and you could try to like get it out there too, like just a bunch of marketing, get it hype on a bunch of people. That's an advantage that some certain studios and people have. Like they just have more money, they can advertise it to more people, and so they can kind of blitz the market in that way. But what Peter's saying here is like he acknowledges the fact that he's made this very specific type of movie for a specific type of viewer, and if they're going to try to have success, it's going to have to be like incremental and build and start to stack wins. He's not going to be able to blitz the market because they didn't have enough budget to do that. Like they just weren't working with a studio of the size where they could compete at that level. So they had to play a different game, which is kind of like what we talked about in the last episode I did back on Ghost of Tsushima when I was talking about the early days of the studio that made Ghost of Tsushima, which is this studio called Sucker Punch Productions. For them, they had this realization of like, one of their mantras was we have to put our company on territory that's favorable for us. Put our company on territory that's favorable for us. And the example for them was like this game came out that on the PlayStation 1 and it had these really unbelievable cutscenes. It was like super high graphic at the time. And they knew that they just didn't have the technical, they didn't have the ability to make a cinematic game in that way for their very first game. So instead of making a game on the PlayStation 1, which had more power to do something like that, they instead made a game on the Nintendo 64. This is back in the 90s, because the N64 was a widely popular console, but its processing power, because you're making games on a cartridge and not a disc, it was weaker in terms of what you could do with it. So they wouldn't necessarily have been expected to make a game as cinematic with cutscenes like that on the N64. And so that allowed them to get more acclimatized to game making in an environment that was more friendly to them. That was territory that was favorable to them. So that's where they put themselves. So it's kind of like what Peter is saying here, where it's with a movie like Brain Dead, it's not going to be favorable to the film to try and do 500 prints. It's going to have to build it up slowly over time. You can fan a flame, but sometimes it just takes time. But for example, at Cannes in 1992, when the area in which people the market size is much smaller, it's very contained, they were going to do anything they could to get their movie noticed. And so they papered the town every single day at Cannes. They would get up at the crack of dawn and they would go and paper Brain Dead posters all over Cannes. Just anything to try and get their movie noticed. And Brain Dead was noticed. It was well received by critics at the time. Peter was actually starting at this point to get offers from Hollywood, but he didn't accept any of them. And actually, truthfully, he said, I started getting some offers after Feebles, but nothing's worked out yet. With other people, of course, I write and direct my own films. So why should I get tangled up in the nickel games over here in Hollywood when I can just happily do my own stuff back home? Actually, my situation isn't about staying there or coming here, but finding the money necessary to do other kinds of films. The New Zealand Film Commission has a financial limit, so I'll have to find American or European money at some point. I understand what working for a studio is about, though, making someone else's film where they make the decisions. I've read about the situations with Alien 3, and I know I'd hate a nightmare like that. I just don't need it. I'm not looking to direct Die Hard 3, and that actually throws people off, especially in Hollywood, where everyone expects you to jump at something like that. And Peter wasn't just talking the talk. It's not Hollywood's coming to him with offers to direct terrible movies. He got brought a film by Sam Raimi, who was one of his idols, and he turned the offer down. Which shows he's not just talking the talk. He's truly walking the walk of he's getting broad offers of movies he would probably be interested in doing, but he was committed to the types of movies that he wanted to make. And I think when you think in the context of the Sam Raimi offer and the type of movie that Sam Raimi is bringing him, Sam Raimi, known for Evil Dead, similar gory movies, which is what Peter Jackson is becoming known for at this stage in his career, Bad Taste, Meet the Feebles, and Brain Dead were all gory, graphic films. Granted, they had a comedic bent and they were all splat stick, but I think Peter was trying to avoid being pigeonholed by Hollywood. And if he takes the Sam Raimi offer at this stage in his career, it probably really locks him into this gory splatter movie director that he didn't want to be. On this note, Ken Kamins, Peter's agent and manager, and ultimately a producer of his films like The Hobbit, said that the Hollywood machine has pigeonholed a lot of very fine filmmakers, which is frightening. It can take a Tobe Hooper, a John Carpenter, or a Wes Craven and force them to stay in that genre because Hollywood is a very unimaginative town and pigeonholing is one of its specialties. It's all too easy to be stifled by the genre you're in and never really be offered anything else. Working in New Zealand made it easier to avoid being pigeonholed because we were generating and driving our own projects. And so for Peter, his number one priority, the thing he wants to do, which is what he's always wanted to do, is make movies. And if Hollywood was going to get in the way of him making the movie he wanted to make, he wasn't going to deal with Hollywood. And he was only going to go to Hollywood when Hollywood was going to enable him to make better movies, to make the movie that he wanted to make. Like he talked about, he's going to hit a glass ceiling in New Zealand from a funding perspective. And so when he hit that ceiling, that's when he was going to go to Hollywood. When he had a movie idea that he needed the type of funding he couldn't get in New Zealand, that's when he would look elsewhere. And so for Peter at this stage in his career, the ideas that he didn't feel like he needed to go to Hollywood just yet. He was perfectly comfortable staying in New Zealand. And even though he turned down this Sam Raimi film of whatever the idea was, is likely another splatter film, even though he turned that down, he's still starting to earn this reputation as a splatter film director. He has this reputation, which is why Sam Raimi is coming to him. And when talking about this, Peter said, you get into a situation where you have to top yourself every time, do better than the film before. And I don't want to spend my life making films that have more gore than the last one. There'd be no end to it. When I was thinking about this idea, it's like you don't top yourself by being bigger. You top yourself by being different. And Peter was definitely about to go and make something different, completely unlike any of the 3 films he'd made up to this point. But this idea of you top yourself by being different, not by being bigger, reminds me of God of War, the video game franchise. They had made these video games on the PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation 3. The first one comes out, it's one of the greatest PlayStation 2 games of all time. They put out the second game, it takes everything they did in the first one and they make it bigger and better. And so it does even better than the first game. And then they put out the third game in the franchise and it's on the PlayStation 3. So there's more processing power now. And the game is even bigger than bigger than you could ever have possibly imagined. And the graphics look better and it's just like a much better video game. And like they leveled up once again. But they hit this point with God of War 3 where like they kind of hit the precipice of like as big, like bigger. You couldn't really go bigger than God of War 3. Like you kind of hit the threshold like of how impressed people could be by just going bigger. And so when they put out, you could say God of War 4, which is technically a prequel, they tried to go even bigger again. And they did achieve bigger. Like the levels in God of War 4 are even bigger than the incredibly big levels in God of War 3. But people were no longer impressed with like, we've seen you do this trick 2 times now. We're going to need something different. And so after that, so they go 1, 2, 3, and then 4 kind of lags a little bit. They just reinvented the entire game and they made the game completely different. And that game that they put out, we'll say God of War 5, just for the context here, becomes one of the greatest video games on the PlayStation 4. Not because they tried to be bigger, but because they tried to be different. And for Peter, when he makes Brain Dead, it's considered at the time, still today, one of, if not the goriest movie ever made. And so for him, it's like, what am I going to try to do to make an even gorier movie? Like I've done that. It's time for me to do something different. And that different movie that he ended up making is called Heavenly Creatures. You can also find this movie on YouTube. I believe the version that I watched is the New Zealand cut of the film, which has a scene in it that's not included in the rest of the cuts of the film. And we'll talk about that scene. But the movie is about the 1958 Parker Hume murder in New Zealand. And the Parker Hume murder is where 2 schoolgirls, I believe at the age of 15, murdered one of the girls' mothers. And there was accusations of them being lesbian lovers. And it was this very like not glorified, but like this very dramatized court proceeding. Like the whole trial was like a media circus. And at one point, Peter and his partner, Fran Walsh, I think actually mentioned it to Peter, and Peter became more and more interested in this case and turning it into a film. And there must have been something in the water at the time because there was like 3 or 4 films about this case that were all kind of in production at the same time. Like Dustin Hoffman was working on a film. There was a stage play about it that was being turned into a film in New Zealand. Peter and Fran were working on it. And I think somebody else was working on their own version of a movie based on this case. Dustin Hoffman even tried to convince Peter to direct his version, and Peter turned it down to do his version. And Peter ultimately ended up getting made. It's called Heavenly Creatures. It's the debut film for Kate Winslet and Melanie Lynskey. I think Kate Winslet at that point in time had been doing commercials and maybe some TV shows, but she'd never done a feature. And what was important to them was they wanted to cast girls who looked like the girls from the case. They wanted to cast someone that looked like Pauline Parker and someone who looked like Juliette Hume. And Kate Winslet looked like Juliette Hume. She was British in real life, and Kate Winslet is obviously British, and so they cast her. But Pauline Parker, who's from New Zealand, they couldn't find somebody who looked like her. Like they pretty much went through any actor that could potentially play her in New Zealand. They just weren't satisfied. And it was getting close to the time to shoot the film, and they were starting to get a little bit panicky about the fact that they hadn't found the girl to play Pauline Parker. And so eventually Fran Walsh, Peter's partner, she's like, I'm just going to go find somebody. And so she jumps in her car and she's going like town to town, school to school, going in and being like, hey, I'm making this movie about the Parker Hume murder case. I'm looking to see if we can find a girl to play one of the leads. Can I speak to the girls around this age? And so she was going and going and going. And they were kind of like a little bit skeptical at a lot of places because she was rolling up in like a rusty Ford Cortina. And they're like, if you're making a movie, shouldn't you be like arriving in a limousine or something like that? Like, what? I don't know if I trust you showing up in that car. But she would talk her way in, and eventually she goes into a classroom and she finds Melanie Linsky. And she auditions Melanie, and Melanie does a good enough job. And then they fly her out from the town she lives in all the way to go to shoot this movie. And I just thought it was fun that like they discovered Melanie Linsky for this film. And what they decided, like part of the reason, like the casting was obviously so important that like the movie is centered around these two girls. And so often the take that people take when they're thinking of adapting this into a film or a stage play is they focus on the circus that was the trial. But for Peter and Fran, when writing Heavenly Creatures, they weren't interested in that. Instead, for them, they wanted to focus on the relationship between the two girls. Because to them, it was this interesting thing. What made the story so interesting was this idea of you have this like these two girls who are just really close friends, potentially fall in love, and you have this story that's like just a classic story of like two people could be falling in love, and it just goes to this extreme place. And it's like, how does it, wait, how does this relationship end up like morphing into this ugly thing over here? And that to them was like the crux, like what made this story interesting. So that's where they focused the story that they wanted to tell. And they did do like for this, when the writing of Heavenly Creatures, they did extensive first party research. They went to Christchurch where it takes place. They went to locations where the girls went, where they lived, where they went to school, where the murder happened. They went and spoke to people who knew the girls, who were their classmates, who were their teachers, who were related to them. Like they spoke to, like they did a lot of firsthand research to flush out the details of the story. And I say that very intentionally, to flush out the details of the story. Because before they really did any research, like they did some minimal research, like to understand kind of what happened. And then they decided they're not going to do any more research to start. What's more important to them is they have the bones of what happened here. They have a general understanding. Now they're going to write the story. Once they'd nailed the story and they knew the story that they wanted to tell, then they went and did the research, the deep research, the interviews with people. Because they didn't want, they knew that they were writing a story. They were not writing a report. And so for them, before they got too much embedded into like what the details of what happened, they wanted to make sure they had a story that was compelling. So they didn't making a documentary or writing a report. They were writing a script. They were telling a story. So they started with the story first, and then they did a bunch of research to fill in the details of that story. It's not, again, to call back to the Ghost of Tsushima episode, this is obviously like a true story, but the lesson here is like you want to ground your fiction in fact. Like with Ghost of Tsushima, they told this story that takes place on a version of Tsushima Island that is a fictional story that they came up with. But a lot of the stuff you see in that fictional story and in this like fictional version of Tsushima is real, because they went and studied Tsushima Island in the 1200s, and they were able to make the world of their video game feel real because it had real detail, that had real explanations. And so for Peter and Fran, when writing the story for Heavenly Creatures, they went in and they figured out the story, and then they made that story feel so much realer by having a bunch of real detail around it. And so it's not like they made up the story, but they focused on like the narrative that they wanted to tell. Like they had the story in place before doing the research. Another thing I talked about with like Peter Jackson and with Bad Taste, like they didn't have a script, and that's not necessarily like advice you should follow when making your own film. Another piece of advice, or something that Peter does that I'm going to tell you about that's probably not the best advice to take, especially if like you're writing your own screenplays, is the script for Heavenly Creatures had a lot of camera movement written into it. Which, if you're writing your own screenplays, like a piece of advice or like a critique you'll get a lot of times if you're like screenwriting competitions and you have this in there, like people are reading your scripts, is you shouldn't have any camera movement in there. That's not for you to do as the writer, that's for the director to figure out. But Peter is the director of his films. And so for Peter, he's going to include a lot of camera movements in his script, because for him, like even from the first draft moving forward, everything is a shooting script. And so for him, he writes with a lot of camera movement in the screenplay. And what's interesting is part of the reason that ended up happening specifically with Heavenly Creatures is in their research for the film, they learned that the two girls really liked this one singer. And so they started listening to his music. It was this opera singer. And they started listening to his music when they were writing the screenplay. And so when they were listening to the music itself would like influence the camera movements. Because like when writing it, Peter would be picturing the film, but the music is playing. So what he's picturing in his head is being scored by the vinyl. And that music is influencing the way in which he's picturing the movie in his head, which ultimately ends up influencing the camera movement that you see on screen. And Peter had never written with music up to that point. This is the first time he'd done it. And I talk about this idea of like breaking your process all the time, which is like doing something in a weird way, whether it be like if you play a saxophone, it's like flipping your hands so you're playing in reverse. Or George Miller likes to watch his movies and he flips the screen left from right so that he can kind of watch the movie with fresh eyes. Or like Nate Fox, who directed Ghost of Tsushima, tests this game sometimes with the controller upside down, so he has to be more intentional about how and like think about how he's actually interacting with the world more clearly than if he was just playing with the controller normally, because he can do it like on autopilot. And here, like I often think about these grand ways of breaking your process, but it could just be like layering in a new piece to the process you don't normally do. That's really all it is. And so for Peter, breaking his process, quote unquote, in this instance, was just playing music while he was writing. He just tried something new. That's really what breaking your process means. Try something new when creating that you wouldn't normally do to see what results come out. When it came to the script, the final draft of Heavenly Creatures was actually the edit, which is a cliche saying that your final draft is done in the edit. But there's one scene I talked about in the script that they took out during the edit, didn't make it into the film. This movie was being distributed by Miramax. So even though they were making it in New Zealand, they finally had a distributor in the US, and that was Miramax. And Miramax was really pushing them to cut a scene in the movie. It was just like a tennis party that was happening, and the two girls were like spying on some people at the tennis party. And Peter and Fran, they'd already kind of put the movie out in New Zealand, so it had this scene in there. But Miramax is pushing them to cut the scene with the tennis party, and Peter and Fran ultimately agree to take the scene out. They didn't just agree to take the scene out, they agreed that the film was better without the scene. And the reason they felt that it was better without the scene was that scene slowed the film down. And slowing the film down is okay, that's not the issue. But what they realized was that they didn't feel that scene told you any new information. And so it was just kind of there slowing the pacing down unnecessarily. So every scene that you have in the movie needs to justify its existence. It has to have a reason for being there, which is interesting. And as I'm saying that out loud, I feel like the counter, like how that's counter to what we just talked about, like Brain Dead and Avatar, where like sometimes you just have things in there because you want them to be there. But I guess if you think about Brain Dead and Avatar, the argument you could make is like the reason that it's there, it's self-indulgent, but I'm doing it because the fans will enjoy it. But this scene here, even they think it slows the film down and the fans won't enjoy it. So there really was no justification for having this scene in there, so they took it out. Another reason that they took it out is they realized that as they went on through making the film and editing the film, they thought that the story was going to be about both Juliette Hume and Pauline Parker. And they realized that, actually, this is more of like Pauline Parker's story that we're going to focus on. And so that scene was kind of written from the perspective where, like, if it did add any information or any details, like it was more about Juliette's story, Juliette Hume. And they realized through the edit that, oh no, this is actually not about Juliette. This is about Pauline. This is her story. And so they took that scene out. And Peter said, when you're writing a script, part of you thinks, this is perfect. We mustn't change a word of it. But once it's finished, it takes a life of its own. And that's just the thing I talked about, right? Where it's like you have ideas in your head and even ideas on the page, and trying to take those things and bring them into the real world, they never end up looking like exactly what you had written. Life has its own ideas, and your job as an artist is to be able to react to those ideas as they are presented to you. So obviously this movie is far more of a drama than anything. And the way in which they shoot the murder is, if you're a Peter Jackson fan at this point in time, like you're probably expecting it to be a little graphic. And the way in which it's shot is very not graphic. You don't really see much at all. It's a very different tone to his other films. And when being asked about this, and like if, he does these splatter films, and then he does this drama film, if there's like this intentional move for his career to try not to become pigeonholed. And at the time, Peter said, I have no set plan for my career. To me, it was simply that I was interested in making this film. It's something new, and that is good. But I've always seen my other films as being different from each other in certain ways. This is obviously a greater leap, however. It is much more of a mainstream film. There's no doubt about that. It's interesting that people whom I have never met have all these assumptions about my career. People immediately assume that filmmakers do things because of a grand plan. People are no doubt saying, oh, Peter Jackson wants to be taken as a serious filmmaker now. He's sick of being branded as a splatter filmmaker, and he wants to do arty mainstream films. That's not true. I do intend to do other splatter films. I have intentions of doing all sorts of films. I have no interest in a career as such. If I were really oriented, I'd be in Hollywood now, making Hollywood films and earning lots of money. I choose to stay in New Zealand, earning a fraction of what I could make in Los Angeles, because I want to do whatever I feel like doing. We talked about how with Bad Taste, when people are like, oh, Peter should make a Bad Taste 2, Peter, you should make a Bad Taste 2. Peter immediately was like, no, I don't want to make a bad. It's almost like Peter Jackson he subverts expectations because he doesn't want to deal with what those expectations bring. Obviously, when he makes The Lord of the Rings, like there's no subverting those expectations with the amount of money that they were spending on that. But for Peter, like up until this point in his career, it is like literally just, there's this idea that David Senra, who does a podcast called Founders, where he studies great entrepreneurs and shares what he learns studying them. And he has this thing he learned studying an entrepreneur, and I can't remember who it was, but it's this idea of follow your natural drift. Follow what is interesting to you. And that is what Peter is doing for his entire career. And actually, with the word career, like I like what he says is like, I have no interest in a career as such. Like he's not thinking through his decisions in this grand picture of like, this is how it's all going to fit together. That's not how he thinks. For Peter, it's like, what do I want to do right now? What's the movie I want to make today? I'm going to go make that movie. It's not, okay, I just made this movie. If I make that movie next, then it's going to lead to this thing. And then that's how it's all going to fit together. And like, it's never been that. Even from the beginning, right? He wasn't making Bad Taste because this is going to be the first film. And it's going to be this opportunity. It's like, no. He just wanted to make Bad Taste. And he just wanted to make Meet the Feebles, kind of. Because his Meet the Feebles, you could argue, was more so his hand was forced a little bit more there, but it was still based on an idea that he had come up with originally. Brain Dead, because he wanted to make Brain Dead. Heavenly Creatures, he made it because that's the movie he wanted to make at that point in time. He's setting up his career in such a way where he can just follow his natural drift and do what it is he wants to do. Because I think as soon as you try to like structure things and have this like master plan and put all these rules in place, like it can become unfun. And I'm saying that from a place of experience with this show. Like I've been putting a lot of expectations on myself to make art, to make it a thing. And I was putting so many rules in place as to how I wanted to do the show that I started to actually hate it. Like I was not having fun doing art well. I remember at one point I was walking into work. It was a Monday morning. I was like, I'm so glad to be going into work right now because there's going to be something that's going to distract me from thinking about the podcast. Like I was thinking about how I wanted to do it, what I was going to do it, and how the order in which I was going to do the research. And then if I have to read this many interviews today so that I can like get to the end of the research for this movie so I can watch that movie tomorrow. And then I was like coming home from work. I was like, oh my God, I got to watch The Lord of the Rings, and I'm going to watch the extended edition because I've never seen the extended edition. And I feel like that's important for doing this Peter Jackson episode. And okay, I got to watch The Lord of the Rings. It's like 3 hours, 3.5, 4 hours long. Okay, I'm just going to come home from work and I'm just going to put it on right away so I can watch it and finish it. And I just got to get through The Lord of the Rings. And okay, I got to get through the next one tomorrow. And okay, I might take a break, but I got to watch The Lord of the Rings. When I watch the next one, I have to watch The Lord of the Rings. And I was like at this place where it's like, oh my, like I'm creating a prison of my own making. I took this thing that I love to do that was supposed to be me just following my natural drift, like watching movies in this way and doing the research and reading the biographies was like something I was just doing on my own for fun. And then I tried to turn it into a podcast and I started to hate it. Like this, I loved podcasting. I loved researching. I loved watching movies. I loved learning about them. And I put them all together and I turned it into something that sucked. Like the show quality is good and I'm proud of what I made, but the process in doing it was like wearing me down. And so now I took a week off the show and I was just trying to figure out like, how do I get to a place where I can make the show healthy? And like really the realization I had is like, I just need to take some of the rules off of it. Like the show is probably going to shift more to like focusing on studying art over artists. Like I'd already done like a lot of the Peter Jackson research. And so there's got a little bit of a hangover in the way I'm going to do the show right now. But it's going to get to a point where it's like, instead of doing an episode where it's probably going to be 3-4 episodes of Peter Jackson, I will just jump right into like one movie. Like, oh, I would have just done The Lord of the Rings. And then what am I interested in once that's done? Like, I also created this rule of like every single thing that I do has to be connected to the one that came before it. And then I like had the whole plan of like, hey, I was going to do I did Lord of the Rings or I did J.R. Tolkien, and that was going to get me to Peter Jackson because of the Lord of the Ring connection. Then I was going to do the Halo video games because there's a Peter Jackson connection there. Then after Halo, I was going to do this. And it's like, and then I was just like, but then by the time like I'd had this plan since like September. And so now I'm recording this in March. By the time I was like, I bought an original Xbox, like I was so excited about Halo. And then I just got to the point where I was like, I'm no longer excited about this. Like I was delaying what I was excited about until I got there by following these rules that I put in place for myself, but like trying to have not a career, but like the structure, like thinking about how it all fits together, that it was no longer fun. And so I'm like, just kind of like didn't burn it all down, but I like took a break and I was like, I'm going to finish this Peter Jackson one. I'm going to do it in a slightly different way to make it more fun for myself. And then I'm just going to follow my natural drift. I'm not going to think too far ahead. I'm going to do an episode of the show and then be like, okay, what do I want to do the next episode on? And I think the quality of the show is going to get better because of that. I think my output is going to become more consistent. I'm going to become better because I'm going to be recording more often versus like before it was like, I'm going to do like a 4-week sprint of research and then a 2-week sprint of recording and editing, like 8 hours worth of footage versus now it's like going to become, I'm hoping, more playful. You're going to be able to feel that I'm more excited about this thing when I'm recording. Like I'm not going to get to the point when I am recording and the feeling I have is like, okay, I'm like coming to the end of the marathon and I just got to get through this. Like I want it to become more playful and I want to just follow my natural drift, which is what Peter Jackson was doing with his career. He was just making the things that he wanted to make. And one thing too about this idea of like just bouncing from thing to thing to thing, like even if there's no like grand vision, like how do they all fit together? Peter was saying like, even though Heavenly Creatures was completely different from Bad Taste, which was completely different from Brain Dead, which was completely different from Meet the Feebles, it's not like there was lessons he couldn't apply to Heavenly Creatures. Like lessons are transferable. They are not genre dependent. Like if Peter had tried to make Heavenly Creatures as his first film, it would have been much worse. If he tried to make it as his second film, it would not have been as good. If he tried to make it as his third film, it probably still wouldn't have been as good. But because he made it as his fourth film, he had 3 films worth of experience that he was bringing into it. Just because there wasn't blood, guts, and gore didn't mean that he wasn't a more developed filmmaker at that stage. And he talks about the idea like just because you make a splatter film doesn't mean you are incapable of telling any other kind of story. And this idea of like pigeonholing an artist is just such a funny thing. But one thing I want to talk about here is like Peter's commitment to New Zealand. Like it's admirable how committed he is to his home country. One thing he talked about is like there's this development problem for New Zealand directors. Like for the New Zealand film industry. Is like the path was often like make 2 to 3 films. And at that point, you've really started to like come into your own as a director. Like you've really developed, which is just an interesting note on its own, that like it takes about 3 films to start to come into your own in most cases. But once a director from New Zealand had finally started to get that, they just go off to Hollywood. And so the talent wasn't being retained. They had like a talent leak problem. And for Peter, it was important to him that he stay in New Zealand. And he has held firm with that throughout his entire career. Not only has he stayed in New Zealand, which has attracted a certain level of production and budget to him, but he's also developed the New Zealand film industry. Like Peter has kind of grown, the New Zealand film industry has grown alongside Peter. The capabilities of New Zealand have grown alongside Peter. Like there are studios in New Zealand that exist because Peter Jackson built them for his films. Weta Workshop, Weta Digital exists because Peter Jackson got to this point where he was like, okay, I one, I'm going to keep making movies, and I don't want to have to try and go and recruit the same team again. I'd much rather just keep the band together, and we can get better and better together on every single film. And so he made these companies to like keep everyone employed, so they would work on his films when he needed them, but then they would go work on other people's films, but they would always come back and work on Peter's films together. And so he like built these companies to help foster the New Zealand film industry, somewhat selfishly to like work on his films, but it's also giving back to the place he came from. And today, the most notable of those companies is like Weta Digital, Weta Workshop. Like Weta Digital is one of, if not the top digital effects firm in the world. In 1987, it was known, Weta Workshop at least, was known as RT Effects, which was Richard Taylor. In 1993, he kind of bands together with Peter and they formalize it into Weta Workshop alongside Weta Digital. So Weta Workshop is like the practical effects, the miniatures, the prosthetics. Weta Digital is digital effects. And this is 1993. And so Weta Effects, or Weta Digital's first film was Heavenly Creatures. Like Weta Digital was made to do the effects for Heavenly Creatures. And for Peter, like he is helping to grow the industry in New Zealand, but he's also investing in it. Like when they needed this, Peter decided to go and buy top of the line equipment. Like ILM, who even to this day is like one of, if not is the other top effects firm in the world. They were the top effects firm in 1993. And Peter's like, we have the same equipment as ILM. We just have less volume. Like they have 50, 60 machines. We have one. But so Peter bought the gear for Weta Digital for his film for Heavenly Creatures. And today it has grown and grown and grown. Again, it's one of the top effects firms in the world. They do Avatar. They do a bunch of the Marvel movies. They've done like just like so many films and TV shows. And what's interesting though, what Peter says, like they bought all this gear for Weta Digital to do the effects for Heavenly Creatures, but they didn't really know how to use it. And he said it just like Kiwi ingenuity and figuring it out is how they figured out how to do it. And I think that's just like so, like this is just this current that runs through his entire career of like, we're just going to figure it out. And it's like, it's funny, like everything and everyone starts somewhere. Like the digital effects firm that did Avatar started with just a couple dudes from New Zealand being like, how do we use this box? Everyone starts somewhere. And the effects in Heavenly Creatures, especially when you consider the time that they were made, are quite impressive. And there's even, because they have Weta Digital and Weta Workshop, there are scenes in that movie where you think are entirely digital effects, but it's actually some practical effects, like, and they're merged together in the way that which you don't even realize. And so you think the visual effects are even better than they are, because what you're actually looking at is real and it's not a digital effect, it's a practical effect, but you don't realize that. And so it's quite impressive what they did back in 1993, 1994. And like really like what I feel like doesn't get talked about enough with the fact that like Peter Jackson started Weta Workshop, or I guess technically like Weta Digital. He just latched on with Richard Taylor with Weta Workshop. Like Peter's entire career has been about effects. And so the fact that he started one of the top effects firms in the world is not a coincidence, because he's always wanting to just use effects in whatever form to make the best movie he can. And so he creates, again, his ambition as a child wasn't to be a director, was to be a special effects guy. And he then founds one of the top special effects firms in the world. But they had their humble beginnings with a couple of dudes from New Zealand looking at a box, being like, how do we figure this out? And the work they did on Heavenly Creatures is quite impressive for the time. The movie itself is well received, especially by critics. Peter and Fran get their first Oscar nomination for Best Original Screenplay. Hollywood really comes knocking after Heavenly Creatures. My fun fact of like Hollywood come knocking, like the opportunities that come their way, is, as I just love when like past episodes of the podcast kind of like click together in funny ways, where like but like people I profile like overlap. And this one of the opportunities that came Peter's way was the opportunity to direct Planet of the Apes. And the original pitch for Planet of the Apes was it was going to be written by Terry Hayes, who wrote Mad Max 2 and 3. Peter would direct it, James Cameron would produce it, and then Arnold Schwarzenegger would star in it. Peter and Fran, they really thought about it, but they ultimately thought that they wouldn't have power in that situation with someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's like probably at the peak of his powers at that point, and James Cameron, who's coming off of T2, True Lies, which True Lies, I believe at that point in time was like the highest grossing film or the highest budget for a film of all time at that point. So like they felt like they wouldn't have the power on set and they would just get pushed around by James and Arnold. And they were like, we sometimes wonder what would have happened if we'd said yes, because we met James Cameron many years later and he's quite a lovely person. And so that's just a fun what if in Hollywood history, is Peter Jackson directing Planet of the Apes, written by Terry Hayes, produced by James Cameron, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. But even though they didn't make that, the next movie they did make was more of a traditional Hollywood picture, and that was The Frighteners. And The Frighteners is this movie about, I think his name's Frank Bannon, and that's Michael J. Fox's plays this guy who is he can see ghosts, and he plays like a sleazy like psychic who goes to homes to like help rid them of the ghost problems that they're having, get rid of their poltergeists. But because he can see ghosts, he's actually friends with all the ghosts. And so they're like running a scam of like his ghost friends go and like mess up the house. He shows up, his friends just leave, and then he gets paid like $500. And so he's like running this scam. And that's kind of like the beginnings of the story is this guy. And maybe it's Frank Bannister, not Frank Bannon, something like that. And they came up with the idea for the Frighteners during Heavenly Creatures. Like they came up with the idea and they wrote a treatment, which again, we talked about. Peter likes to have his projects overlapping. This is another example of like having a backup plan or having his next thing in his back pocket. What's actually interesting is like sometimes you hear people talk about treatments and they talk about like outlines and they talk about the screenplay and it's like, what does that actually look like? And I watched the documentary in the making of The Frighteners, and they show the treatment for the film, and it's just 2 pages. Title, genre, setting, act 1, act 2, act 3. That's it. And like sometimes like I feel like we overcomplicate what these things can be. At least I do. Like, what does a film treatment look like? What should it be? And even like I remember the first time I looked at a screenplay, the first screenplay I ever read was a screenplay for Seven. And I remember looking at it and being like, this is a script. I could probably do this. Like, I think it's so much easier to get some of these ideas out of our heads than we give them credit for. Like a 2-page treatment is something you could do in like 45 minutes. It might not be perfect and you might have to go back and like edit it and stuff, but like there's a low barrier to entry to some of this stuff. And we might stress ourselves out being like, oh, I got to write a whole script. Like a script is going to take me so long, but like you could probably do 2 pages. Like just start with step 1. Don't worry about step 1,000 or step 4. Just do step 1 first. But Peter and Fran, they write this treatment for The Frighteners, and the original intention is actually for it to be just a movie they're writing for someone else. They're writing for Bob Zemeckis, who was going to be making a feature film for Tales from the Crypt. And they pitched this to Bob Zemeckis as his movie for Tales from the Crypt. He was going to direct it. He reads it though, and he decides that it'd actually be better if Peter directed this movie. And it wasn't Tales from the Crypt, it was a separate thing. And Peter agrees, but his one condition, even though the film is set to take place in California, they shoot the film in New Zealand. And they're like, you know what? Fine. If you can find somewhere in New Zealand that looks close enough to California, we'll let you do it. So they find somewhere that looks similar enough. They like completely redo the town. They like change street signs and license plates and everything to make it look like California. And they get the deal. So they make the movie. Bob Zemeckis, who of course is the director of Back to the Future and Forrest Gump, helps them get Michael J. Fox to star in this. And one thing about the casting that I actually thought was really interesting was Peter and Fran acknowledged that as writers, they weren't as funny as they would like to be. And so part of their casting was they wanted to cast comedian or comedic actors who could come up with funny lines or funny one-liners on the spot that Peter and Fran never could have. And they were very open to the input and the collaboration of the people that they were working with. Like the lesson here is like find actors or collaborators who make your project better. The ultimate ambition for you as an artist isn't to boost your ego. It is to make the thing you're trying to make as great as it possibly can be. And sometimes in order to do that, you have to hire people who are better than you at certain things. So your goal is you want to find collaborators who make your project better. And Peter and Fran were self-aware enough to realize we think we're funny, but we're not that funny. And so we should find people who really are that funny. And that's going to make our film better. And when talking about the writing of this and the casting, he said, if you get the script right and the casting right, it becomes very difficult to make a bad movie. We wanted to make sure we got the very best cast for the characters. Get the script right, get the casting right. It's very difficult to make a bad movie. And when it came to The Frighteners, not only did they have a good script, they had good casting, but they also had a great director. So there's something good was bound to come out of this. And Universal realized this when they saw test footage, or they saw footage of the film for the first time. And not to mention, Weta Digital was getting better, and so their effects were getting better. And so Universal sees the footage for this movie, and they're like, oh, we have something. This could be our Ghostbusters. And so what was supposed to be a movie that was coming out in October around Halloween, it has ghosts. They're like, this could be a summer blockbuster. So they moved the release up to July. So they cut some of the post-production time down, and Peter and team kind of, they don't panic, but that adds a lot of stress, especially to the team at Weta Digital. And so they have to go on like a hiring spree and get a bunch of talent to come in and just get a bunch of these extra effects shots done. And one of the people that they brought in for this like hiring spree was Wes Takahashi. And they actually kind of poached him from ILM. And he said something that I thought was really smart. And this was in the documentary on the making of The Frighteners. And he said, often the creative process is doing things to realize what you don't like, to find out what you do like. The creative process is doing things to realize what you don't like, to find out what you do like. I love that. Like, I think part of the reason is because it's hard to describe what you do like, especially if you're trying to do something that you've never done before. And so in order to do that, you kind of have to see it. You'll know it intuitively, but you can't describe something you've never seen. And so you have to, the notion is like, bad ideas are what leads you to good ideas, because it's the bad ideas, to Wes's point here, that show you, that allow you to articulate what it isn't. It's not that. We have to, okay, it's not that, try this instead. It's not quite the feeling. It's not that, oh, I think it's try this. Okay, this. And then, oh, that, yes, that's exactly what it's supposed to feel like. Like there's this notion of like, if you try to be too perfect in the beginning, it's going to prevent you from actually getting there. Like you need the bad ideas to lead you to the good ones, because the bad ideas tell you what it isn't. And obviously, like I'm a big proponent of like striving for perfection. And this is not me saying counter to that. I think perfection in the beginning and perfection at the end, striving for perfection in the beginning versus striving for perfection at the end are two very different things. The point here is like, if you're trying to be too perfect in the beginning, you're going to play it too safe to have the bad ideas that are ultimately going to lead you to the good ideas. Like having a bad idea is okay, because if it propels you further ahead in the end. We don't settle for bad ideas. We just try bad ideas to see how they feel, and we keep trying things until we find the right thing. The creative process is doing things to realize what you don't like, to find out what you do like. And again, that's from Wes Takahashi, who was hired by Weta Digital from ILM to help with this like push, this hiring, this push they were trying to do to get The Frighteners out on time for July. And Peter certainly had some issues with them moving up the movie from October to July. One, the Olympics were happening. The Atlanta Olympics was 1996. And so US-based Olympics, and Peter mentioned this to Universal, and they were like, well, we're not really that worried. Like, we don't think that the Olympics is going to have that big of an impact on the box office. And Peter was like, how do you know that? Like, there's been 3 Olympics in the United States in the last 100 years. Not to mention the movie went up against Independence Day at the box office. Peter was quite unimpressed with the marketing for The Frighteners as well. If you look at the poster, it's like a white poster with like a spooky face impression coming out of it. He said he didn't really tell you anything about the picture. And so it was just like a confluence of these things that ultimately led to The Frighteners being a disappointment at the box office. But I don't think anybody looked at The Frighteners' disappointment as the fault of the director. Like Peter Jackson at this point had, maybe not from like a full mainstream perspective, but from a Hollywood perspective, had earned the respect of pretty much everyone in Hollywood. Like he had arrived as a filmmaker to reckon with at this point in time. But for Peter, the key word there is filmmaker. Like what Peter cared about anything was being a filmmaker. All Peter wanted to do was make the movies that he wanted to make. He wasn't trying to get caught up in all of this Hollywood game that wasn't interesting to him. It's never been interesting. All that's ever mattered to Peter is making the best movie he could make. Marty Walsh, who was a unit manager for Meet the Feebles, said that Peter is a filmmaker, not a poser director. He is the real deal. There are no duplicitous agendas. There is no tyrannical, egocentric power play. He is only there to make the film. That is his mission, and it is the opportunity to share in that mission that earns him the loyalty and commitment of others. From Bad Taste all the way up to this point in his career, The Frighteners, all Peter wants to do is make the film. Even going all the way back to Bad Taste when he was only shooting on Sundays with his friends. And when he was asked about this, and he was like, would you ever make a movie like Bad Taste ever again? Shooting it every weekend over 4 years. Peter, after a second, went, no. But if I had to start over and no one else was financing the films, I would rather make movies than not. Thank you so much for listening to my deep dive into the early films of Peter Jackson. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. If you want to support the show, I have one simple ask. Send this episode to just one friend who you think would like it too. And if you want to get even more Artwell, I have a challenge for you. Go and listen to an episode of somebody you've never heard of before. My bet is that this show only works is if you can listen to any episode and still get value from it. And now, go do your thing. Whatever it is, do it well.